Hey everyone, welcome. We're so glad you're here today. In this video, we'll dive into a powerful story from the Bible, exploring some deep lessons about trust, faith, and spiritual renewal. We'll look at the incredible journey of Hezekiah, the Assyrian invasion, and the challenges faced by God's people. So grab a seat, relax, and let's journey through this powerful message together. Stick around. I promise you won't want to miss this. After the reign of King Solomon, Israel experienced a deep and significant division. The once united kingdom of Israel was split into two parts. The northern kingdom, which retained the name Israel, and the southern kingdom called Judah. This division was not just a political one, but a spiritual one as well. The northern kingdom of Israel, consisting of 10 tribes, broke away and established its own kingdom, leaving Judah with only 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The people of Israel were left without the central worship place in Jerusalem, and it wasn't long before the northern kingdom fell into idolatry. In fact, the first king of Israel, Jeroboam, immediately set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, leading the people into false worship. He feared that if they traveled to Jerusalem for worship, they might feel more connected to the southern kingdom and potentially return to Judah. So, he created his own system of worship, convincing the Israelites that they could worship God in these new places. But it was a compromise that led the people away from God's commandments. As time went on, the northern kingdom fell deeper into idolatry, worshiping not only golden calves, but also other gods of the surrounding nations. The kings of Israel were consistently wicked, and each one, without exception, led the people into further sin. There was no king in Israel who led the people back to God. Instead, they kept following the sinful paths laid before them. Over and over again, God sent prophets, such as Elijah and Elisha, to warn the people and call them back to him, but they ignored the prophets, refusing to turn from their idolatry. Israel had forsaken the one true God, and despite God's great patience and repeated warnings, they continued to reject him. As a result, God's judgment was eventually poured out on the northern kingdom. The Assyrian Empire, a ruthless and powerful force, was rising in strength during this time. The Assyrians were known for their brutality and their practice of exiling conquered peoples. In 722 BC, God allowed the Assyrians to invade Israel. The Assyrians laid siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel, and after a 3-year siege, the city fell, and the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated, and the people were scattered and exiled across the Assyrian Empire. This event marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel and the beginning of the fulfillment of God's judgment. The Assyrians didn't simply conquer Israel, they took the people captive, dispersing them throughout their empire. They also brought people from other conquered nations into Israel, mixing the populations. This forced assimilation led to the creation of a mixed group of people who would later become known as the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a blend of Israelites and foreigners, and this intermarriage led to significant cultural and religious differences between them and the pure Jewish people of Judah. The fall of Israel to the Assyrians was a tragic and significant event. It marked the end of the northern kingdom and the fulfillment of God's warnings. Israel's repeated disobedience and unrepentant heart had led to this moment. The Assyrian conquest was not just a political disaster for Israel, it was a spiritual failure as well. The people had been given countless opportunities to turn back to God, but they chose to follow the ways of the world instead. The judgment that fell upon them served as a warning to Judah, the southern kingdom, and to all people throughout history. It showed that sin has consequences, and God's patience does not last forever. The northern kingdom's exile was a powerful reminder of the importance of staying faithful to God, and the significance of this event is felt throughout Scripture. Even though Judah, the southern kingdom, still had some righteous kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, the fall of Israel should have been a wake-up call to them. Yet, despite the example of their northern neighbors, Judah too would eventually fall into sin. But for now, Israel's destruction was complete. The 10 tribes that once made up the northern kingdom of Israel were scattered and lost. The people would never return to their land as a united kingdom. The Assyrian invasion had wiped out Israel's identity as a nation. The loss was so profound that the 10 northern tribes would be referred to as the lost tribes of Israel. and their fate would remain a mystery for centuries. But the lesson from this tragic history was clear. Disobedience to God brings judgment, and the time to repent is always now. The fall of Israel also serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of worshiping God in the way He commands. Israel had made their own gods, their own systems of worship, and when they rejected God's ways, it led to their destruction. They tried to worship God on their terms, and in the process, they lost everything. The Assyrian conquest was a direct consequence of this rebellion, and it highlights the danger of idolatry. God's judgment was not just about punishing Israel for their sin, it was also a warning to all nations and all people throughout history. God is patient, but He will not allow sin to go unpunished forever. The fall of Israel should serve as a reminder to us that we must be careful not to fall into the same traps of idolatry and disobedience. In our own lives, we must be vigilant about what we allow to take first place in our hearts. The people of Israel chose to follow false gods, and it led to their destruction. Let us learn from their mistakes and keep God first in our hearts. The fall of Israel is not just an ancient story, it's a timeless lesson for us today. If we turn away from God and follow our own desires, we too will face the consequences of our sin. The Assyrian invasion was a moment of great loss for Israel, but it also marked the beginning of God's plan to ultimately redeem His people. Though Israel was lost to history, Judah remained, and through them came the line of David, from which the Messiah would eventually come. Even in judgment, God's mercy and redemption are at work. The fall of Israel is a sobering reminder that God is a righteous judge, but it also points us toward the hope of salvation that would come through Jesus Christ. So, as we reflect on the fall of Israel, let us remember the importance of staying faithful to God, of worshiping Him in the way He has commanded, and of repenting when we stray from His path. The fall of Israel was not the end of God's plan. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in His redemptive story. And for that, we can be thankful. The origin of the Samaritans can be traced back to a pivotal moment in Israel's history, the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. After the fall of Samaria in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer the land, they reshaped it. The Assyrians, known for their brutal tactics, had a strategy when they conquered nations. They would exile a significant portion of the population and replace them with people from other conquered territories, bringing in foreign nations to settle in the land. This was part of their efforts to prevent rebellion, as these displaced peoples were less likely to unite against the Assyrian Empire. In Israel's case, the northern tribes were largely taken away, while the Assyrians brought in people from places like Babylon, Cutha, and Hamath. The result was a blending of cultures, traditions, and, inevitably, people. The survivors left behind in Israel, mostly the poor and the lowly, began to intermarry with these foreigners, forming a new group known as the Samaritans. This mixture of Israelite and foreign blood created a unique ethnic and cultural group, distinct from the pure Jewish people of Judah to the south. The Samaritans weren't just a mixed race, they were also caught between two worlds, holding on to elements of their Israelite heritage while being heavily influenced by the foreign practices of the people brought in by the Assyrians. As time went on, this fusion of cultures and traditions led to the Samaritans developing their own distinct religious identity, which further deepened the rift between them and the Jews. The tension between the Samaritans and Jews grew over the centuries. Jews, who saw themselves as the true descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, considered the Samaritans to be a mixed people, both racially and religiously. The Samaritans, in their eyes, were half-breeds who had corrupted the faith by intermarrying with Gentiles and adopting some of their customs. This prejudice was not just social, it was deeply theological. The Samaritans' version of worship was seen as heretical by the Jews. While both groups acknowledged the authority of the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Torah, the Samaritans rejected the rest of the Old Testament, including the books of the prophets and the writings. They also practiced a modified form of Judaism, observing some of the same festivals but in a way that was distinct from Jewish tradition. One of the key points of contention was the place of worship. The Samaritans believed that Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, was the true and holy place where God had commanded worship to take place. They had even built their own temple there, which was considered by the Jews to be a blatant act of idolatry. For Jews, Jerusalem was the only legitimate place to worship, the temple and the city being the heart of their faith. This disagreement over the correct place of worship only fueled the animosity between the two groups. The hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans was evident in the Gospels as well. Jesus himself encountered the prejudice when he spoke with the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. In the encounter, the Samaritan woman is surprised that Jesus, the Jew, would even speak to her. Jews didn't associate with Samaritans because of the long-standing hatred and mistrust. In fact, Jewish travelers would often go out of their way to avoid passing through Samaria on their way to Galilee, taking a much longer route to avoid contact with the Samaritans. This wasn't just casual dislike, it was deeply rooted in centuries of cultural, religious, and ethnic division. Despite this animosity, Jesus took the time to engage with the Samaritan woman, offering her living water, and in doing so, he shattered the boundaries of prejudice that divided the two groups. Jesus' actions were revolutionary, showing that God's love and grace extend beyond ethnic and religious boundaries. But the story of the Samaritans is not just about the hostility between them and the Jews. It's also about how they navigated their own unique religious identity, because the Samaritans rejected the broader Jewish scriptures and adhered only to the first 5 books of the Bible. Their religious practices were a blend of Israelite tradition and the influences of the foreign nations they had intermarried with. They held fast to the worship of God, but their rituals and understanding of the faith were distinctly different from those of the Jews. Mount Gerizim became the focal point of their worship, and they revered the place as sacred, claiming it as the true location chosen by God, despite the Jewish belief that the temple in Jerusalem was the one true holy place. The Samaritans also preserved a version of the Passover, but their observance was different from that of the Jews, and over time, the division between the two groups became more pronounced. This religious divergence became yet another source of tension. As the centuries passed, the Samaritans remained a small and relatively isolated group. While their numbers never rivaled those of the Jews, they persisted, maintaining their own identity and religious practices even as the larger Jewish population continued to grow. Over time, the Samaritans would be regarded as outsiders by the Jews, often treated with disdain. Their unique religious views, coupled with their mixed ancestry, made them a subject of scorn and rejection. Despite their efforts to maintain a semblance of their ancient faith, the Samaritans were never fully accepted by the Jewish people, and they were always seen as a group that had compromised their heritage, and as a result, they were marginalized and pushed to the fringes of Jewish society. The Samaritans' history is a complex one, shaped by both external forces and internal conflicts. They emerged as a people in the wake of the Assyrian conquest, their mixed heritage becoming a symbol of their divided past. The tension between the Samaritans and Jews serves as a powerful reminder of the destructive power of prejudice, the deep divisions that can arise from differences in belief and identity, and the importance of overcoming these divisions. Through the story of the Samaritans, we see that true worship and faith are not defined by ethnicity, background, or place of origin, but by a sincere heart toward God and a willingness to follow His ways, no matter the cost. Hezekiah's reign as the king of Judah was marked by a significant spiritual revival and a fierce commitment to purging the land of idolatry. He became king at the age of 25, and from the outset, he showed a heart that was radically different from the many kings before him. While Judah had experienced a series of kings, most of whom were spiritually corrupt or indifferent to the ways of God, Hezekiah was determined to restore true worship to Judah and cleanse the nation from its spiritual decay. One of Hezekiah's first actions was to reopen the doors of the temple of the Lord, which had been shut during the reign of his father, King Ahaz. Ahaz had been one of the most wicked kings Judah had ever known. He had not only allowed the worship of foreign gods, but had even gone as far as to close the temple and set up altars to false gods throughout the land. When Hezekiah became king, the state of the temple was a sad reflection of the nation's spiritual condition. The people were far removed from God, worshiping idols and engaging in sinful practices. So Hezekiah knew that the first step in bringing about reform was to restore the temple as the center of worship. He gathered the priests and Levites and called them to consecrate themselves and prepare the temple for proper worship. Hezekiah then ordered the removal of the altars that had been set up to false gods throughout the land. Under the reign of his father, Judah had been polluted with idol worship. These altars were everywhere, standing in defiance of the true God of Israel. High places where sacrifices were made to idols were scattered across the kingdom, and Hezekiah knew that the people needed to return to the one true God, and that meant removing every vestige of idolatry. In his effort to purify the kingdom, Hezekiah ordered the destruction of the high places, those sites where the people had worshipped false gods. He commanded that the altars to Baal, the Asherah poles, and the idols that had been erected in honor of foreign gods be torn down and completely destroyed. It wasn't just about removing the physical structures, but about breaking the people's attachment to the idols that had led them astray. Hezekiah understood that true worship couldn't coexist with these distractions, but Hezekiah didn't stop with just removing the altars. One of the most significant acts of reform he took was the destruction of the bronze serpent that had been made by Moses during the time of Israel's wandering in the desert. This serpent had been a tool of healing. In Numbers 21, when the Israelites were suffering from poisonous snake bites as a result of their sin, God commanded Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it up on a pole. Anyone who looked at it would be healed. This was a powerful symbol of God's grace and provision, pointing toward the ultimate healing that would come through Christ on the cross. However, by the time of Hezekiah's reign, the bronze serpent had become an object of worship. The people had turned it into an idol, burning incense to it and treating it as though it had some divine power in and of itself. In the eyes of the people, it had become a relic to be worshipped, rather than a symbol of God's mercy. Hezekiah, in his wisdom, recognized that the bronze serpent had to be destroyed. It no longer served the purpose for which it was created, and its continued existence only led the people further into idolatry. So, Hezekiah broke it into pieces and had it destroyed. This act of purging the kingdom wasn't just about the physical idols, it was about the spiritual renewal that Hezekiah sought to bring to Judah. He knew that in order for the nation to turn back to God, it wasn't enough to remove the outward symbols of sin. The hearts of the people had to be restored to their true worship of the living God. This was the essence of Hezekiah's reforms. He wanted the people to return to the kind of wholehearted devotion to God that their ancestors had known. Hezekiah also worked to restore the proper observance of the Passover. The Passover had been a critical part of Israel's worship, reminding the people of their deliverance from Egypt and their covenant with God. But during the reign of Ahaz and the wicked kings before him, the Passover had been neglected. Hezekiah called for a great celebration of the Passover, not only in Judah, but also inviting the scattered remnants of Israel in the northern kingdom to join in. His message was clear. It was time for the people to return to the covenant they had made with God. This wasn't just a token religious observance. It was an opportunity for the people to renew their relationship with God, to once again align their hearts and lives with His will. And while the Passover was a central part of Hezekiah's reforms, they were not limited to the observance of festivals. Hezekiah sought to restore the Levitical priesthood to its rightful place. Under the reign of Ahaz, the priests had been neglected, and the people had forgotten the importance of proper leadership in worship. Hezekiah called the priests and Levites to their proper roles, urging them to consecrate themselves and return to their duties in the temple. He recognized that without the leadership of faithful priests, true worship could not be restored. Hezekiah's reforms were not only practical, but deeply spiritual. It was clear that Hezekiah trusted in God with all his heart. His actions were not driven by political motivations or personal ambition, but by a sincere desire to honor God and purify the land. Hezekiah was not trying to merely strengthen his own rule. He was seeking to bring the people of Judah back into the right relationship with God. His actions reflected a deep understanding that spiritual renewal begins with the removal of idols and a return to true worship. Through his reforms, Hezekiah demonstrated that the health of a nation is ultimately tied to its devotion to God. If the people's hearts are not turned toward him, then no external efforts or achievements will matter. The true strength of Judah, Hezekiah knew, was in its relationship with God. The physical reforms, the destruction of idols, the cleansing of the temple were signs of a deeper spiritual renewal that Hezekiah hoped to see take root in the hearts of the people. Under his leadership, Judah experienced a revival of sorts. The people began to return to God, worshiping him in the way that he had prescribed. They offered sacrifices, celebrated the Passover, and sought to live in obedience to God's commandments. Hezekiah's reforms were not perfect, nor did they immediately erase all the problems of the kingdom, but they set a course for spiritual restoration, and for the first time in a long time, the people of Judah had a king who cared more about their spiritual well-being than about political alliances or military strength. His reforms were a model for future kings, and his reign would be remembered as one of the high points of Judah's history. Hezekiah's reign serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of spiritual leadership. His reforms show us that it is not enough to simply go through the motions of worship or to pay lip service to God. True renewal comes when we tear down the idols in our lives, both the physical ones and the spiritual ones, and make room for God alone to occupy the throne of our hearts. Hezekiah's reforms remind us that God desires a people who will worship Him with sincerity and truth, who will seek Him above all else and trust Him completely. It was through this kind of spiritual leadership that Judah experienced revival, and it is through this kind of leadership that we can experience renewal in our own lives and communities today. The fall of Israel to the Assyrians marked a tragic turning point in the history of God's people. The northern kingdom of Israel, long plagued by idolatry and disobedience, finally faced the consequences of its unfaithfulness to God. In 722 BC, the mighty Assyrian Empire, under King Shalmaneser V, laid siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel. The siege lasted for 3 years, and eventually, the city fell. The Assyrians, known for their brutal tactics, didn't just conquer the land, they took the people of Israel captive, scattering them throughout their empire. The 10 tribes of Israel were lost, never to return as a unified nation. Those left behind were the poorest, and the land was repopulated with people from other conquered territories. This mixing of peoples, the Assyrian practice of deporting the conquered and importing new populations, led to the creation of the Samaritans, a people who were seen by the Jews as a mixed race, both ethnically and religiously. While Israel was falling to the Assyrians, Judah, the southern kingdom, watched in fear and anticipation. Judah had a king who trusted in God, Hezekiah, but the Assyrians were a terrifying force, and their advance toward the south caused widespread panic. The news of Israel's destruction by the Assyrians sent shockwaves throughout Judah. The people feared that they would be next, and the fate of the northern kingdom was a grim reminder of the potential future for Judah. The Assyrians had already been sweeping through the region, conquering other nations and expanding their empire. King Sennacherib, the successor of Shalmaneser V, set his sights on Judah next. Judah, once a proud nation under King David and Solomon, now found itself facing the most powerful empire in the world at that time. Sennacherib's army, an immense and terrifying force, marched toward the cities of Judah. The Assyrian army was known for its cruelty, and their methods of war were designed not only to defeat, but to utterly demoralize their enemies. The Assyrians would often lay siege to a city for months, cutting off supplies and starving the population. If a city fell, the people were either slaughtered or taken captive and transported far away from their homes. Judah's cities were no match for the sheer might of the Assyrian army, and the fear of what would happen if Sennacherib attacked Jerusalem was palpable. Hezekiah, in an effort to prepare for the coming invasion, took several strategic actions to fortify the city of Jerusalem. He built up the walls of the city, made weapons and shields, and even created a water supply by constructing a tunnel to bring water from the Gihon spring into the city. These measures were necessary to defend the city from a siege, but Hezekiah knew that human preparation alone was not enough. The people of Judah needed to turn to God for deliverance. The Assyrian king, Sennacherib, was not one to shy away from intimidating his enemies. He sent a powerful message to Hezekiah, mocking the king and the God of Israel. In a series of letters and messengers, Sennacherib boasted about the Assyrian victories and told Hezekiah that his gods would not be able to save him. The Assyrian king even sent a messenger to speak directly to the people of Jerusalem, attempting to incite fear and rebellion against their king. The messenger, known as the Rabshakeh, stood outside the walls of Jerusalem and delivered an intimidating speech in Hebrew, ensuring that all the people could hear. He told them that they had no hope and that Hezekiah's God could not save them from the mighty Assyrian army. Hezekiah's response was not to be intimidated. Instead of retaliating or making alliances with other nations, he turned to God in prayer. Hezekiah went to the temple and spread the letters from Sennacherib before the Lord, asking for his help. He recognized that the battle was not his to fight, but God's. Hezekiah's faith in God was evident in the way he responded to the threat. He didn't turn to Egypt for help, as some of his predecessors might have done. Instead, he trusted in God's promises and sought his intervention. The people of Judah were gripped with fear, and the tension in Jerusalem was palpable. The Assyrians were known for their brutal tactics, and the people knew that if Jerusalem fell, they would be subjected to the same fate as the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians were ruthless in their conquests, leaving no stone unturned in their efforts to expand their empire. The very thought of being conquered by such a violent empire was enough to cause despair. Yet, in the face of overwhelming fear, Hezekiah's faith stood as a beacon of hope. Hezekiah sent his officials to the prophet Isaiah, asking for a word from the Lord. Isaiah, a prophet who had warned Israel and Judah about their idolatry, assured Hezekiah that God would deliver them. Isaiah told the king not to fear the Assyrian king, for God had heard their prayers and would fight for them. God spoke through Isaiah, assuring Hezekiah that Sennacherib's army would not even shoot an arrow at Jerusalem, and the city would remain safe. The message was clear: Judah's deliverance would not come through military strength or human alliances, but through the power of God. The people of Judah, though fearful, were encouraged by God's promise through his prophet. The Assyrian army, which had been poised to attack Jerusalem, was struck by a mysterious disaster. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. When the remaining troops woke up the next morning, they found their army decimated. Sennacherib, realizing the defeat, retreated back to Nineveh, and the siege of Jerusalem was lifted. The people of Judah were saved, and the city remained intact. The victory over the Assyrians was a miraculous act of God. It was a clear demonstration that God was in control, and that no matter how powerful an enemy might appear, he was more than capable of delivering his people. The people of Judah, though initially filled with fear and intimidation, experienced God's deliverance in a mighty way. This event not only spared Jerusalem, but also affirmed the faith of Hezekiah and the people. It showed them that in the face of impossible odds, God was their true source of strength and salvation. The fall of Israel to the Assyrians was a sobering reminder of the consequences of turning away from God. Israel's destruction served as a warning to Judah, but it also highlighted God's faithfulness in the midst of his people's struggles. When Hezekiah and the people of Judah faced overwhelming fear and intimidation, they chose to trust in God, and he proved faithful. The miraculous deliverance from the Assyrians is one of the most powerful examples of God's protection and provision in the Bible, reminding us all that when we place our trust in God, he is able to deliver us, no matter the circumstances. Even though Hezekiah is remembered as one of Judah's most faithful kings, there was a moment during his reign when his faith faltered after the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrians. When Sennacherib's army was struck down by the angel of the Lord, one might expect Hezekiah to have unwavering confidence in God's protection. However, when the Assyrians regrouped and continued to threaten Judah, Hezekiah, in a moment of fear and desperation, made a decision that was not in line with his earlier trust in God. In a misguided attempt to avoid a full-scale invasion, Hezekiah made the decision to pay off the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, with an immense sum of silver and gold, hoping that this would satisfy the Assyrians and spare Judah from the destruction they had faced in Israel. This decision marked a significant moment of compromise in Hezekiah's leadership. Rather than trusting in God's power and promises, Hezekiah took matters into his own hands. The biblical account tells us that Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple and used the treasures of the royal palace to pay the Assyrians. He was willing to offer up the sacred resources of God's house to a pagan king in order to secure peace. It's important to note that Hezekiah had already been instrumental in restoring the temple, purging idols, and leading the people back to true worship. The temple treasures were symbolic of God's provision and blessing, and now Hezekiah was surrendering those sacred things to a secular force. In his fear, Hezekiah's solution wasn't one of spiritual trust, but of pragmatic compromise. the payment didn't work as he had hoped. Sennacherib, after receiving the tribute, didn't leave Judah in peace. Hezekiah had hoped to placate the Assyrian king, but instead, Sennacherib used this opportunity to further his own ambitions. He still sent his army to besiege the cities of Judah, making it clear that the tribute had not secured Judah's safety. This was a painful lesson for Hezekiah, and it serves as a cautionary tale for us today. When we surrender sacred things, whether it's our trust, our resources, or our integrity to secular forces in an attempt to protect ourselves or secure peace, we risk losing the very thing that gives us strength. The treasures Hezekiah surrendered weren't just gold and silver, they were symbols of God's presence and favor. When Hezekiah gave them to the Assyrians, he, in effect, treated these sacred things as if they were mere commodities, to be traded for earthly security. This moment of compromise shows us the dangers of relying on worldly solutions when we are called to trust in God. Hezekiah's decision to try to appease the Assyrians with material wealth rather than turning to God in prayer was an attempt to control the situation by his own means. But it became clear that no amount of silver or gold could protect Judah from the impending threat. This is a powerful reminder for us as well. In life, we often face situations where the pressure to act or resolve a problem can be overwhelming. And while practical solutions are important, we must never lose sight of the fact that our true security comes from trusting in God, not in the material things or strategies of this world. The broader theme of Hezekiah's story is one of trusting in God's provision. Earlier in his reign, Hezekiah had experienced God's miraculous deliverance. He had trusted in God when facing the Assyrians, and God responded by protecting Jerusalem in a way that could only be attributed to divine intervention. Yet, in this moment of fear, Hezekiah turned to his own resources and made a decision that undermined his trust in God. It's easy to think that God's provision in one area guarantees that we will never have to face challenges or hard decisions again. But Hezekiah's compromise shows us that trust in God is not a one-time decision. It's a continual process, especially when we are faced with moments of fear and uncertainty. Trusting in God requires us to relinquish control and to believe that His ways are better than our own. This moment of compromise can serve as a lesson for all of us today. How often do we try to resolve our problems through our own efforts, relying on our own resources instead of trusting in God's plan? Whether it's trying to fix a relationship, secure financial stability, or overcome an obstacle at work, there's a temptation to take matters into our own hands and control the outcome. We might give in to the pressure to do what it takes to ensure that things go our way, even if it means compromising our values or relying on worldly solutions. But as Hezekiah learned, surrendering sacred things to secular forces never brings the lasting peace or security that we seek. When we trust in God, we are called to trust Him fully, even when the situation seems impossible. Hezekiah's initial trust in God led to the miraculous defeat of the Assyrians, but his decision to compromise by paying off Sennacherib ultimately proved to be a failure. God had already shown Hezekiah and the people of Judah His power. What they needed in that moment wasn't more material wealth or a worldly solution, but a continued reliance on God. When we rely on our own strength or resources, we may see temporary success, but it is only God's provision that offers true, lasting peace and security. There's a powerful principle in Hezekiah's story about the importance of keeping sacred things set apart for God. The treasures of the temple, the symbols of God's presence, were never meant to be used as bargaining chips in the world's negotiations. Likewise, our hearts, our trust, and our faith are sacred to God. We are called to give our lives to Him fully, not holding anything back in our attempts to control or manipulate our circumstances. When we surrender the sacred to secular forces, we lose sight of what truly matters. Our trust should not be in the world's systems, but in the unchanging, all-powerful God who promises to provide for us. Hezekiah's story reminds us that true security comes from trusting in God's promises, not in our ability to control outcomes. Even in moments of fear and uncertainty, we must resist the temptation to rely on worldly solutions or compromises. The more we learn to trust God fully, the more we will experience His faithfulness and provision in every area of our lives. In the end, Hezekiah's story is one of growth and learning. His earlier trust in God, when faced with the Assyrian threat, was rewarded with a mighty miracle, but his moment of compromise with the Assyrians serves as a cautionary tale for us today. It teaches us the importance of never surrendering the sacred things of our faith, our trust in God, our devotion, our resources, to the forces of this world in an attempt to secure peace or control. Instead, we are called to trust in God alone, knowing that He will provide for us in ways that we could never imagine. Let's see, when the Assyrians turned their attention to Judah, they used a range of intimidation tactics to undermine Hezekiah's leadership and to instill fear in the hearts of the people. They had already destroyed Israel, the northern kingdom, and the news of Israel's fall sent ripples of terror throughout Judah. The Assyrians, led by King Sennacherib, sought to make Judah bow to their power, and they did so in a way that was designed to break the people's spirit and strip away their confidence in their king and in God. One of the most chilling tactics employed by the Assyrians was psychological warfare. Sennacherib's officials, the Rabshakeh among them, stood outside the walls of Jerusalem and began calling out to the people of Judah. They didn't just speak in generalities, they used their words as a weapon, attacking both Hezekiah's leadership and the very God whom Hezekiah trusted. The Rabshakeh addressed the people in Hebrew, making sure that everyone could hear his words, including the common people who were standing on the city walls. He mocked Hezekiah, telling the people that their king had no power and could not save them from the mighty Assyrian army. He even went so far as to question the validity of Hezekiah's trust in God. The Assyrians knew that the strength of any nation was often tied to the confidence of its people. If they could break the morale of the people and create division between Hezekiah and his subjects, they might have a better chance at conquering the city. The Rabshakeh taunted Hezekiah and his kingdom, saying that trusting in God was pointless. He reminded the people of the fate of other nations that had fallen before the Assyrians, nations that had worshipped their gods and yet were unable to stop the Assyrian onslaught. He spoke as if their God, the God of Judah, was no different from the false gods of the nations the Assyrians had conquered. He even went so far as to say that the God of Israel was weak, unable to defend his people, and that Hezekiah's faith in such a God was foolishness. The Rabshakeh's message was clear. Why trust in your king? Why trust in your God? The Assyrians are unstoppable, and no God has been able to protect any nation from us. Your God will not be able to save you either. This was the essence of the Assyrian tactic, to break down the people's trust in God and in their leadership. The Rabshakeh's words were meant to shake the foundation of Judah's faith, to sow doubt in their hearts, and to make them question whether their king's faith was misplaced. As the Assyrians continued their psychological assault, they also attempted to undermine Hezekiah's authority. The Rabshakeh's speech was not just aimed at the people, it was an attack on Hezekiah's rule. He implied that Hezekiah's leadership had failed, that his trust in God was a poor strategy, and that the Assyrians were more powerful than anything the king could muster. In doing so, the Assyrians tried to create a rift between Hezekiah and his people. They wanted the people to doubt their king's ability to lead and protect them. This was a classic tactic of warfare. Attack the leader and the people's trust in him, and the whole kingdom begins to crumble. The fear that the Assyrians sought to instill in the people of Judah was palpable. The walls of Jerusalem, once a symbol of strength, now became a place where the people stood, listening to the foreign voice outside, and wondering if their faith in God and their king could really save them. In the face of this onslaught, Hezekiah's response was striking. Rather than retaliating or engaging in verbal conflict, Hezekiah did not respond to the Rabshakeh's accusations. Instead, Hezekiah sent a message to the prophet Isaiah, asking for God's intervention. Hezekiah knew that his trust wasn't in his own military might or in the power of his walls. He understood that Judah's only hope lay in God's provision. Hezekiah's response was one of humility and faith. He recognized the power of God alone to deliver Judah. He went into the temple, spread the letter from Sennacherib before the Lord, and prayed earnestly, asking God to save his people for his own glory. The response of the people of Judah was equally remarkable. Though they had heard the Rabshakeh's mocking words and felt the weight of fear upon them, they did not panic. Instead, they remained silent, as Hezekiah had instructed them to do. They trusted that God would defend them, just as he had done in the past, in silence. They demonstrated their trust in God's power to deliver them from their enemies. This act of silence was not a sign of weakness. It was an act of faith. They did not need to answer the taunts of the enemy. They knew that their response was not to be found in words, but in their trust in God's sovereignty. And God did respond. He heard Hezekiah's prayer and sent the prophet Isaiah with a message of hope. Isaiah told Hezekiah that the Assyrians would not enter Jerusalem, that they would not even shoot an arrow there. God would defend the city, and Sennacherib would retreat in defeat. The people of Judah, who had been paralyzed by fear, were now filled with a quiet confidence. Knowing that God had promised to deliver them, true to his word, God sent an angel to strike down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. When the remaining Assyrians awoke the next morning, they found their army decimated, and King Sennacherib was forced to retreat to Nineveh. The people of Judah were spared, and Jerusalem was saved. This moment is one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's faithfulness and power in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The Assyrian tactics of intimidation had failed, not because the people of Judah were strong, but because they placed their trust in a God who is stronger than any enemy. The response of Hezekiah and the people of Judah, turning to God in prayer, remaining silent in the face of mockery, and trusting God's promise of deliverance, is a lesson for all of us today. In times of fear and intimidation, we too can find peace in God's presence, trusting in his power to overcome the forces that seek to harm us. We are called to remain silent before our enemies, not because we are helpless, but because we know that God will fight for us. The Assyrians may have tried to break the faith of Judah, but in the end, it was God who proved victorious. And in this, we find our greatest hope that when we place our trust in God, he will always come through, no matter the opposition. As we reflect on Hezekiah's story, let's remember the power of trusting God fully, especially in times of fear and uncertainty. No matter what challenges we face, God is always with us, ready to deliver. If you found this message encouraging, go ahead and give a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Keep trusting in God's provision and his promises, and let's continue to walk by faith together. Take care, and thanks for watching.